Sin and guilt. When I was at the London School of Economics training to be an anthropologist, I remember we had an internal exam and I wrote an essay for it on this subject of sin and guilt because I'd become very interested in that, partly through editing the diary of a 17th century clergyman, Ralph Jocelyn, whose diary as a Puritan clergyman was filled with an obsession with his minor faults and sins and his feelings of guilt. The most extreme example was when his beloved daughter Mary died, and he was absolutely devastated, and he examined himself to see what might have caused this, and he decided that he'd been playing too much chess and God had been angry with him and taken away his daughter. Now that encapsulated much of my own upbringing, because I was brought up in the heir to a Calvinist Protestant ethic, which placed responsibility on the individual, and that meant that if you committed any internal offence, a bad thought was as bad as a bad deed, then you had sinned against God. And there was no longer the Catholic way of overcoming that through penance and forgiveness and so on, but you carried the sin around with you and the guilt. And this was internalized in a way which some anthropologists contrast with shame. Shame being something which you feel if someone else knows that you've made some fault or other. But as long as it's internal, then you don't feel anything particular. It's overdone, but there is something in that sin is something which is very prevalent if you believe in a God who is watching your every motion and every thought, and as soon as you deviate, then he punishes you. It's like a parent who has got a surveillance device in your bedroom as a child and watches everything that you do wrong. And this kind of weight was brilliantly illustrated in James Hogg's Confessions of a Justified Sinner, a brilliant early 19th century Scottish novel about the devil pursuing someone who'd committed a murder. And it was something I carried around and assumed was normal. And the great liberation really was going to Nepal when I did fieldwork there in my mid-20s and discovering a society which didn't have a sense of sin and guilt. They talked about pab kaba, which meant sort of some fault which would perhaps jeopardize you in some way, but it wasn't really built into Buddhism or shamanism or even Hinduism, this sense of sin and guilt. And when I went to Japan, and particularly when I went to China, the same thing. The whole obsession with sin and guilt was absent. Missionaries noticed this when they went to China, and they said it was really hopeless trying to make the Chinese into Christians because they had no sense that they needed Christ to redeem them from their sins. They weren't born in sin, and there was nothing to be redeemed from, and therefore they didn't feel the need for Christianity. And so gradually through my life, through anthropology, of course earlier when I just read about other societies, I'd discovered that many of them didn't have any concept of sin, which is more or less seems to go with the monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, but is extreme. The extreme form is in the Calvinist form of Protestant Christianity. And of course it is a great way of forcing people to conform, because the more they fail, the more God punishes them and the more they try. And one of the most popular books ever published, Pilgrim's Progress, is about that weight of sin and so on. So sin and guilt were there through much of my life, but now as I reach my later ages, I can relax. Doesn't mean I behave any more badly or think any more evil thoughts. It's that I don't immediately feel a sense of deep guilt about them.